If you're looking for a simple chicken noodle soup recipe, you've landed in the right spot. My wife was feeling a little sick, and this is always what she calls for, and it couldn't be easier to pull together. In this video, I'll show you my family's favorite recipe for chicken noodle soup, and I'll share with you two things that I think really make a difference in this soup. The first thing I like to do is prep my vegetables. And for these carrots, I'm not even going to peel them, because they look pretty good as is. I also like this recipe because it gives me a chance to work on my knife skills. And so I'll cut these in half, and then start cutting them into discs that are about this thick. And so I'll cut the rest of the carrot to try and match that size. And because we're making it homemade, we have the choice here to make it as chunky as we like. We usually like larger chunks of vegetables in ours, but if you like it a bit more bite-sized, then you can dice everything a bit smaller than what I'm doing here. Next, I'll move on to the celery, and here I'm using 2 stalks. And I'll cut these down to about the same size as the carrots, so that way I end up with about the same size pieces of carrots and celery in the final soup. After I get the celery cut up, I'll move on to the onion, and here I'm just using half of an onion. And I'll dice this up, and this one I don't need it to be the same size as the other two. And then I'll cut up 2 cloves of garlic as well. I like the flavor of garlic in here, but I don't like it to be overpowering. But if you really like garlic, you could easily add another clove to make it more to your liking. So I'll just smash these to remove the skin a little bit easier, and then I'll chop it up pretty small. And then last is the parsley. And this is one of those things I was mentioning before. I really think that fresh parsley really makes a difference in the final soup. It really adds a nice freshness and brightness to the soup that I really like. I know some people like to add a little bit of lemon to theirs as well for this brightness, but I've never tried it. I take a fairly decent sized bunch of the parsley, and then I'll pick through it to look for tougher or larger stems, and then I'll remove those. Although a lot of them can stay in and won't affect much. So I'll roll them up and get it into a bunch, so then I can run my knife through it and chop it up pretty fine. So once I'm done with the vegetable prep, here's what I end up with. It's pretty close to about a cup of each vegetable, and then a tablespoon of garlic. Now I'll move on to the chicken, and for this, I just like to place another cutting board on top of my other one. And then I can just add this smaller cutting board to the dishwasher when I'm done. And here I'm using boneless, skinless chicken breasts, and I like to season both sides with salt and pepper before I cut them up. And I'm going to cut these up into chunks that are about the same size as the vegetables. So first I'll cut them into strips, and then I'll go the opposite way to dice it up. And I have to keep in mind that I have to cut these a little bit smaller, because that as it cooks, it'll tighten up, and when it does that, it kind of like plumps up a little bit, and so I have to cut this just a little bit smaller. And the full recipe and directions are also linked down in the description below. Now that I have it all prepped, I'll head over to the stove and get my Dutch oven onto medium heat. And like a lot of soups, this one comes together in one pot, which is always nice for cleanup. I'll also add in some canola oil into the pan and let that come up to temperature before I add the chicken. I like to start with the chicken first, so that way I can develop a bit of color on it and also develop a bit of fawn on the bottom of the pan. All of which will add a deeper chicken flavor to the finished soup. And I like to let this first side sit for a few minutes before I start to stir or move the chicken, so it can really start to brown before I shake it up. And I've got a bunch of chicken, so I'll do this in 2 batches. If I put it all in at once, it will drop the temp of the oil too much. And then we'll end up almost steaming the chicken rather than browning it. It does take a little bit longer, but it's worth it for sure. And this is the color we're looking to get on the chicken. Also, there are these bits starting to form on the bottom of the pan too. Now that this side is looking good, I'll stir it around so I can brown the other side as well. Now that I have all this browned, I'll move it off to the side and get my vegetables started. And I'll go in order of hardness as I add the vegetables. The carrots will need just a little bit of head start, and so those will go first. I'll cook these for about 4 minutes, stirring it often. So I'll check the carrots periodically just to see how they're coming along. Next up will be the celery, and that doesn't cook for very long before I add in the onion. And the onion will be done once it goes translucent, and for this size of dice, that will take about 5 minutes. This is also where I'll add another layer of salt and pepper as well. I like to add it throughout the cooking, that way I don't have to add a whole bunch at the end. And the salt will also help to pull out some of the moisture in the vegetables, and so we get some good browning as well. And then I'll also add in a bay leaf here, which will add a nice depth of flavor. It's not a required ingredient by any means, but it does add a little something to the soup for sure. And once I add that in, I like to add the garlic in last so it doesn't burn. It really only needs to cook for about a minute or so, and so that's why it'll go in last. And then once the onions are cooked, I'll add back in the chicken, along with any juices that collected in the cup as well. and that'll get all that mixed together. And if you have homemade chicken stock, you're more prepared than me, and your soup will be just that much better. But here I'm using some of the bone broth from Costco. I've started to use this more than my usual Swanson chicken stock, and I like it quite a bit. Then I'll get this up to a simmer, and then back off the heat and let this go until the vegetables are softened up to our liking, and the chicken is finished cooking all the way through, which for me was about 8 minutes. And then this would be a really good spot to freeze this soup if you want to save it for later. I like to freeze it before I add my noodles in, so that way I can just finish with the noodles and the noodles don't get overcooked. And for our noodles, we really like good thick egg noodles in our soup. But you can use whatever type of noodles you like or whatever you have. And for these, I will use about half the bag because we like a bunch of noodles in ours as well. And these noodles say they'll take about 10 minutes to cook, and so I'll let these go until they're ready. And here these are just about ready, so I'll do a final check for seasoning, and this needed a bit more salt and pepper. And I'll also add in the fresh parsley here as well, so that way it'll keep its freshness in the final soup. And there you have it, a super simple chicken noodle soup recipe. This one always turns out good, and is really nice soup to have for leftovers as well. Each spoonful you get a little bit of each vegetable, along with the brightness of that parsley. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you like these one-pot meals, here's another one I made earlier as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.